Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you talked about what you've seen in Idaho in terms of the closure of the timber mills. We've seen a similar situation in New Hampshire, in northern New Hampshire. And one of those communities that's experienced that kind of closure has been a town called Groveton, which is in very northern New Hampshire. And so they've been trying to think about how can they redevelop some of those closed mills. And they have a local investor, a man named Bob Chapman, who invested $15 million in the site to attract manufacturing companies. But unfortunately, the mill had neither water nor sewage. So the town supported a $400,000 bond, which for that small town was a huge investment. And they did the bond so that they could get another $600,000 grant from the Economic Development Administration. And I got a letter from Bob Chapman who said that, and I'm quoting him now, these public-private investments in broadband internet and wireless cell service and water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as investments in transportation, education, and workforce, are all absolutely necessary to attract companies to move here and to put people to work. And he continued that cutting or eliminating the investment like the EDA, the Northern Border Regional Commission, USDA rural development, and transportation projects would be particularly harmful to small businesses in rural areas. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter his statement into the record. And sure. I know, Mr. Riley, you talked about that because you're dealing with these kinds of communities and you see what a little bit of public investment can do to leverage private investment. So can you talk about what we can do to ensure that both that those programs can leverage the kind of investment that we're talking about and how we make communities aware of what's available and what the impact would be if we eliminate all of those programs, which I just mentioned, that are targeted for elimination in the President's proposed budget for 2018.
Thank you, Senator. I think what I need to say first with these communities is that they have skin in the game. They're interested in their own investment. They're looking at leverage opportunities. In a state like New Hampshire, we have very little state resource that goes into these programs, but the towns, and here's an entrepreneur that's clearly committed to the future of his enterprise and to that community. And I don't believe that he is from Groveton. I think he came from another community, saw the opportunity there and the need, and invested in that site. In some cases, federal programs are criticized for being perceived as duplicative. But we look at this as a broad toolbox that serve a number of different sources and uses from business term people might want to use. EDA funds, for example, only cover certain portions of a project. In this case, economic adjustment programs are critical to allow for studies and assessments to be done on certain sites. CDBG, community development block grants, for example, are important to bring water and sewer and other infrastructure onto the site. Northern Border Regional Commission, a federal commission analogous to the Appalachian Regional Commission in our region, brings the ability to invest in capacity, which is clearly critical for that business itself to run and for support organizations to help him and others really prosper on that site. So those rural development programs, the Rural Business Development Grant, the Intermediary Relending Program, a whole other cast of rural development programs are critical toolbox to allow entrepreneurs to build out their businesses and access the markets that are within that region. So it's a multi-tiered opportunity here to return on the investment that the public sector has to offer. And I do have to say that one of the other pieces that you go into New Hampshire and people know about these funds and people have a high level of what's the word I'm looking for, of wanting to make sure they're done right. They know that these are visible, they know that the senator will come by, and they want them to succeed, and they do their absolute best to leverage the other types of resources that are available, and we really pride ourselves in the region of being proper stewards of public money.
I think that's very true, and thank you. I think, again, as we talk about rural areas of the country, there's a real pride that people have in what they're doing and making sure that people see that and appreciate the commitment that individuals have. Mr. Lettieri, you talked about the uneven recovery between rural America and urban America, and I was particularly struck by your point that while we haven't necessarily seen businesses in rural America close at greater rates. We're not seeing the new startups come in to replace the ones that do close. So as we think about what we can do at the federal level through the Small Business Administration, through policy to help encourage those new startups, what kinds of things do you think are important for us to think about?
Well, thank you, Senator. There's two broad categories I'd lay out. One is that national policy environment. What does our tax code look like? What does our regulatory environment look like? What does our infrastructure look like? How are we investing in basic research? All of those things are linked. And where there's a strong federal role to play, if we're not playing it, the problem's getting worse and it gets more expensive to reverse, more challenging to reverse. Then there's the more micro kind of interventions we can do where there's market failures in policy. And one of those is access to capital, clearly. So you see a regionalization of access to capital that's really harmful and challenging for entrepreneurs outside of major hubs. And so that's an area where I think public policy can play a really important role in a market-based way, but nudging investors into different areas by helping to change the risk profile of those investments, and also leveraging public and private co-investments, as have been mentioned earlier. I think there are some models that we know work, but in all of that, I think it's important to remember that organic, ground-up type of solutions are going to be the most important of all. And so, where can the federal government come in and support a race to the top of what we know is successful in certain local communities, and help to export that to other areas? I think that's a really important primary goal to have in mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Senator Shaheen, anything else for the good of the order?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things. One, Mr. Lettieri, I wanted to follow up on your licensing restriction issue because, I mean, that's a very, as you point out, it's really based mostly on states and how states decide what should be licensed or certified and what shouldn't. So what could we do at the federal level that could help address this problem?
This is going to be an unsatisfactory answer, so that's here's your warning. But shining a spotlight on it, even as a first step, really does have an effect. We've seen since there's a 2015 Supreme Court case that really changed the conversation about occupational licensing and brought a lot of new attention to it. And since then, you've seen a proliferation of states taking the initiative to roll back and reform their licensing regimes and make them much more competitive and open to transparency. So sometimes legislation is not required at any level just to start the inertia towards change and reform. And I think using the bully pulpit that you have here in the Senate and this committee in particular to shine a spotlight on the worst abuses would be an enormously good use of your time, because there are many motivated constituencies that want to bring more attention to this and actually help affect change at the state level. They need your support.
Okay. Sounds like a good hearing.
It was an excellent hearing. Mr. Lettieri, certainly you're not suggesting that the federal government could do this better than the state governments could, are you?
No, he's suggesting we have a hearing on it, which I think is a great idea.
There you go.
Let me also follow up with Mr. Riley. You talked about the Rural Development Innovation Group and the principles to improve programs designed to aid rural communities. Can you talk a little bit about some of those?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator. This Rural Development Innovation Group, as I said before, is a partnership with the Aspen Institute and the U.S. Endowment for Forestry Communities, and has a number of dozen different practitioners from across the country that are in many different districts across the country. We have come down to thinking about two major buckets, as I said before: investing in people, ideas, and markets, not just transactions. And the second is really making sure that investment is scaled to the rural opportunity. Two examples. One, the Rural Business Development Grant, the RBDG, is a great program in its flexibility to invest not only in the capacity of my organization to provide support to entrepreneurs, but direct assistance to those, or direct investments in those businesses themselves. We want to keep that. The part of that program that's more challenging is that the threshold for investment is that the revenues of that company has to be below $1 million. Back when this legislation was put in place, that might have been a significant number. Now it's you know, you're just getting interesting. I mean, not to sound, you know, derogatory, but that's where things are starting to really happen. So at the $1 million threshold, we have to tell Northwoods Manufacturing, because they've been successful in the last year, we can't work with them anymore with that grant source. So the group is really highlighting within specific programs the positive components that we want to keep because it serves a constituency that is important, and those elements that need improvement because they don't work in the context of today's rural environment. And to your question you asked before, I just want to follow up on that. The tools that we have, the Community Development Block Grant, the Manufacturing Extension Program, EDA, if not for these programs, these businesses would not be positioned for growth that they are today, to be employing 12 people, which, as you all know, in rural places is significant. So we have, and I shared with one of your staff, a draft of one of our recommendations on the RBDG program, and this group that we're working with nationally is going to come out with about 12 of them to really focus on key programs, CDBG being one, MEP being another, sorry for the acronyms, that will look at aiding your staff and agency folks as how we from the field see those programs working better in addition to the good work they're already doing right now.
That would be very helpful. Senator Risch and I have both been governors, and so we've seen those programs, many of them from the state perspective as well. And as you point out, for so many of our small businesses in New Hampshire, what we're trying to do gets done because we have lots of partners to contribute to that. Mr. Hobart, you talked about innovation hubs. Well, the CDBG grants have been critical in getting several innovation hubs going in New Hampshire, as well as affordable housing. I mean, they've been really critical to affordable housing. And without some of those partners to participate, it would be really hard to do some of the things that are challenging anyway, but become impossible without that kind of support. And I have to say that the SBA and the Small Business Development Centers and the Women's Business Centers, the effort to help veterans, all of those are also critical as we think about how can we help small businesses. And what we want to do is try and make those programs better. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Inhofe, welcome.